Good morning, everyone. Blueberry Business Group is proud to present our podcast for food industry leaders. My name is Deborah Bacher, and joining me today is Blueberry Senior Advisor Bill Parakis. Recorded live at our offices this Monday, April 13th, 2020. This is our first in a series of podcasts to help you navigate COVID-19 effects on the food industry and your organization. Today's topic is the CEO's next steps. Good morning, Bill. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Deborah. Good morning.
What an interesting weekend of new developments and perhaps even darker outlooks than as recently as Friday. I'm so glad to have this conversation with you today because you shared some very interesting perspectives, and I'm sure they've gotten even better and more pronounced about what's happening inside food companies right now that industry leaders need to be aware of. Could you talk a little bit about that and get us started on the conversation of what you're hearing?
Sure. I can talk about it in two dimensions. The first is in the dimension of the people. So the two themes that I'm hearing are uncertainty and fear.
From the people?
Yes, yes, and the second dimension is concern about logistics and supply chain.
Okay.
But let me go back to the first one.
All right.
And there's the uncertainty and fear is wrapped around, and now these are mid-level leaders, mid to upper mid-level leaders. They're concerned about the safety of their people. They're concerned about not only their safety on the job and enforcing some kind of protocols on the shop floor, but concerned about people going home, potentially becoming afflicted in the work environment and taking that home to loved ones. So it's uncertainty and fear, Deborah. I can say more, but let me know.
Yeah, I think to your point, Bill, what I am finding, and I think what we're all perhaps needing to pay a little bit more attention to is the employee psychology that is being affected by the simple act of going to work possibly being a death sentence. It sounds dramatic, but do you agree that that is lingering in employees' minds when they show up for work every day, those who have not been furloughed or laid off?
I do. I do. And I can give you an interesting example. Employees are using apps to communicate with each other.
On the job?
On the job. Some of them sanctioned, some of them ad hoc. And I say ad hoc because of their need to communicate with each other.
Yes.
And so that's occurring. And much of the chatter is about safety. And let me roll back for a moment. So quality departments, improvement departments, plant leadership are all dealing in crisis mode every day, and so they're communicating amongst themselves, identifying problems in small groups, and then coming up with a solution to problem, and then attempting to communicate that out to the workforce. Now that sounds wonderful, but it's all done in this, again, uncertainty and fear framing. And even though that's occurring, what they are challenged to get done is to audit the things that they decided would be best from the previous week to assure that they're happening in the current week, because in the current week, Debbie, they're faced with a whole new set of challenges.
And just as recently as 2 months ago, this conversation would have been absurd, wouldn't it? the notion that employees would have to be using social media and app technology to communicate 12 feet away from each other. It would have been, we probably would have been ridiculous to be able to bring out that particular work condition. And yet it's that threat and that fear of bringing disease home to families, of being cut off from loved ones, and being able to sit across a lunch table at work to be able to have a conversation. These things have all been changed. Do you think that the upper levels of the organization realize the effect that that's having on employee psychology, or do they need to do a little bit more work in thinking about that?
I think that there's a starving for communication from the highest level of the organization. Mm-hmm. And that communication could be a internal video, but some communication from the highest levels. Mm-hmm. For example, some HR departments are actually surveying weekly the workforce through apps now, asking several simple questions. But here's one that really startled me. The question of, are you able to come into work next week? And I cite that question to raise for your audience and our audience the issue of just how fragile it is in the operating environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So these employees are going home after they've answered that question from HR. They're turning on the news and they're hearing what's happening at the meat plants. Unfortunately, very sadly, what happened with Smithfield and certainly others. They're hearing that grocery store personnel have gotten ill and worse. 41 of them at last count have passed away. We need to have a better understanding here and stay closer in touch with employees that are hearing these messages after the end of the workday and then being asked to come in the following day and to do their job. It's very, very profound, very significant in terms of the impact. Wouldn't you agree?
So true. And here again, that messaging from the top would play an impactful role. And again, the communication is occurring in the workforce. In the organization. I would like to encourage CEOs to be a part of that message, a leading part of that message.
Bill, let me role play with you for a second. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be a CEO and I'm calling you. I'm calling Blueberry. I'm asking for Bill, and I'd like to know, Bill, I've got to get a message out to my people, and I don't know what to say. I don't have data to share with them. I don't have a hard sense of what the future is going to look like. All I know is that I care about them. I want to keep them intact. I know they're worried. Help me to craft the message. What words should I use?
Wow, Debbie, you start. The words that you just used were really perfect. And they were perfect because they were humble, they were sincere, and they were heartfelt. In terms of the tangible, I think the workforce would like to hear what is the organization doing to help protect us, and then what can we do as the workforce over the next couple of weeks? What are the most important things that we can do? So what contribution will be made to us, and what contribution can we make back to the organization? But all framed in that sincerity about things that leaders know to be true, and a frank discussion of things that leaders do not know to be true yet, but are working to uncover.
I think there's a mutual benefit in what you're saying. We know that CEOs, many of them are not sleeping at night. They're worried about the same things that everyone else is,
yes.
Personally and professionally. We know that they may feel a little aimless. They don't really have a clear understanding of where things are going, how long this condition is going to last. I think what I hear you saying is that when they open up that communication as authentically as they can do in the way that you're suggesting with humility and with transparency, is that they get something back. And it's very likely they're going to get a workforce that is as determined as ever to help the organization see its way through this particular crisis, regardless of what's on the other side.
That's our hope for the intended result. May I add another dimension to the need
Please.
for this?
Absolutely.
Um, what I'm hearing directly is that the all of the culture, the elements of culture in organizations, the excellent and good elements of culture in the organization, and the negative and restrictive elements of the corporation from the past are in play today. And in many cases, they're amplified. So the this is kind of a cue to leaders that that it's so critical for senior leaders to get that message right down into the organization. It may not shift the culture, but at least the message will get to where it needs to be heard in the way the leader wants it to be heard.
How does HR inform the CEO that he or she may not be communicating in a way that is certainly the way they intended, or that is particularly effective right now? How does HR inform the CEO? You mentioned they've got some weekly surveys, so to speak, but as you and I both know, in a matter of a day or two, things change so dramatically. But what is CEO's role and relationship with their human resource leader at this time?
Intimate, daily, and if I might add a couple of other members to that discussion,
Yeah, please.
it would be legal,
Yes.
operations leadership,
Mm-hmm.
and HR, all combined. And the reason why I say that, Debbie, is that there are decisions being made on the shop floor which could impact the entire organization in a negative way.
Well-intentioned decisions.
Well-intentioned decisions, yet impactful decisions. And what I'm hearing is that these mid-level leaders want to have legal, HR, and executives, as well as operations management, aligned so that they feel um, clear about the position of the organization and the work that they need to get done. Again, they're solving problems weekly, Debbie, and they really need this cycle of communication with those and maybe a few other key assets of the organization involved.
I'm really struck how before the crisis, the sentiment of most food companies, the excellent ones, were, flip the organization upside down, let employees be more autonomous in their decision making. It almost sounds like that has to be not set aside necessarily, but perhaps redefined with the caution and the liabilities associated with this particular crisis. Would you agree with that?
I agree completely. I do. And I'd like to go back to the second area. So the first
Yes,
of your question was uncertainty and fear. The second is logistics and supply chain. And this is very curious. So the first element is that operations needs workforce, but the second element is operations needs raw materials. And what we're hearing, and this may be stunning to leaders, is hoarding, not of medical equipment or PPE equipment, yet hoarding of raw materials intra-company.
My goodness. So multiple plants, multiple facilities are doing what, Bill? They are accumulating, stockpiling for their own production and output?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
Again,
Wow.
the
Again,
elements
that goes to
of
the humanity and the reaction to feeling this crisis effects. Wouldn't you agree? But you could talk a little bit more about that. That's
um, what what I can say about it is that clear messaging from the top through the organization would help to mitigate behaviors that may ultimately be damaging to the enterprise, uh, to the entire enterprise.
hmm hmm So there's a new flow of energy that has to come from the top of the organization. Um, a new flow of energy where it can be found in the chief executive's relationship with his or her lieutenants, the next level of authority inside the organization. I love the idea of bringing legal into every meeting room. That's an imperative. There's no other way around it. The liabilities are too great. But what you also brought up here was almost an underscoring, if you will, of new rules that have to be in place. You use the example of hoarding ingredients and resources at a time where that's just human tendency to do so. It's protection. It's we have everything that we need. We certainly are seeing it in the hospitals, right? And it's interesting how that particular behavior, in terms of hoarding and protection and making sure that we have what we need in order to do our job, is extending into corporate America and specifically the food industry.
Yes, yes. And another dimension, Debbie, is that um, the enablement of the technology support system to allow remote work.
Mm.
Um, it may not be a very good assumption on behalf of senior leadership to believe that that technology is freely available and is functioning properly in the mid levels of the organization. It requires some attention. So we may have just invited another member to the executive operating team in this crisis, and that would be the IT group.
How often do you think this group needs to huddle together and then define the correct message, the proper message? Is this a daily meeting, Bill, and a daily projection of communication, or is this something weekly or as needed?
At the operating level, Debbie, key constituents are meeting daily.
Okay.
At the operating leadership level, they're meeting weekly. I would like to answer your question by saying that at the highest levels of the organization, it would be um, beneficial to consider meeting every 2 weeks and having a message go out to the organization at that
I
time.
can't I can't imagine anything more important. So organizations have already taken the steps they needed to preserve cash. They've postponed capital projects next year. They are reducing headcount proportionate to the needs of the marketplace right now. But going into this conversation, I thought those were the most important things. And those important things have been done and need to be more of. But listening to you, I've come to the conclusion that this need for greater attention from the top to the middles and the front lines of the organization has never been more important and nothing more critical on the agenda.
I would agree. The communication from the bottom up, it has actually accelerated.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay.
Um, we we it would be wonderful to have another voice in that communication, and that would be from senior leadership.
Bill, I think that is the big thought that we're going to add this, conclude this particular podcast with. Unless you've got something more to add, I think it's been outstanding. You've left so much information for our listeners to think about. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me this morning. You and I talk very regularly anyway, but to have this recorded and to give insight into how we're thinking and what we believe organizations need to do next is vitally important. So thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for letting me channel these voices into this discussion.
Oh, my pleasure. This broadcast was brought to you by Blueberry Business Group. On behalf of Bill and I, thank you to our listeners for tuning in. For more information on Blueberry, please visit our website at www.blueberrybusinessgroup.com.